All right, welcome everybody. Welcome, Vijay. Um, so first off, I wanted to say thank you for spending your time, for all of us spending our time together. We're going to keep things to an hour. Part of it is just because it's late in Chile. And also an hour is a good time to do a webinar. And then we will, of course, save time at the end for some questions. In terms of questions, there is a Q&A function on there, and so you're welcome to put your questions in there. So today is, of course, the anniversary of the passing of Comandante Fidel Castro. He was obviously a very extraordinary person. Armed revolutions in Latin America were more prolific in that time, right? Now, for the most part, there's been a shift in Latin American politics.
Yeah.
In fact, and Foro de Sao Paulo has made it clear that they do not get involved in armed conflicts. And Foro de Sao Paulo is a coalition of leftist parties in Latin America. And so, I think it's fair to say that a small part of his success can be attributed to just the historical conditions of that time. But that's really just the beginning, right? That in terms of what the Cuban Revolution has been able to achieve is really unique. And so the thanklessness with which the Cubans have contributed to the rest of the world is really unparalleled. And that is despite, of course, the unrelenting target of the most powerful terrorist organization on earth, the US government. And so, Vijay, I was just wondering, the impetus of the book was just a series of exchanges between yourself and Dr. Noam Chomsky. In the book, you explain Cuba's extraordinary achievements. And so it's twofold, right? One, that it's hard enough to develop a nationalist socialist project. And then for two, it's not like Cuba is like China, you're really far away. It's 90 miles off the coast of the United States. It's like the Mexican president, Porfirio Diaz, said that about Mexico, like so far from God, so close to the United States. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the book, why you wrote it when you did, and then what was your goal?
Yeah, firstly, I really want to thank you for doing these. I think it's good to have a series of conversations with different people to talk in some depth about politics and so on. I always welcome exchanges like this. The book came out of a particular conjuncture itself. You know, of course, that over the last 5 years, the United States has really ramped up the pressure against Cuba, putting Cuba back on the state sponsor of terrorism list is an indicator of that, really ramped up that pressure. And because of that, as a consequence of that, and then the blights of a world that is facing a climatic torrent, with earthquakes and hurricanes and so on. Cuba has had a hard time, being able to get spare parts for things that break during the hurricane. The electricity grid is in real bad shape. It's been difficult for Cuba to get the raw materials for medicines and so on. Billions of dollars of Cuban wealth forfeited by the US blockade, illegal blockade. There's no UN Security Council resolution that permits the United States to exercise third-party sanctions against Cuba, third party being when it puts pressure on other governments to stop them from trading openly, doing commerce with Cuba. I mean, that's the essence of it. This is not about aid. This is about commerce. United States is preventing Cuba from doing commerce with other countries. If the US doesn't want to trade, that's its own problem. But to put pressure on third party governments, that's a violation of the UN Charter. So in this context, Chomsky and I thought, it's interesting and important to come right at the heart of what this thing is. Why Cuba? In a way, U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Cuba is representative of U.S. foreign policy against any country that defies the United States. And so I think partly the book is about Cuba, the need for intensified solidarity with Cuba, revival of the Cuba solidarity movement, But also the book is a demonstration of how the United States deals with any country in the world that defies it, any country that defies it. Defiance is something the United States cannot tolerate. Now, of course, the world is changing. Large countries are defying the United States, very large countries, sometimes countries that might look like allies. The Indian government, for instance, at the COP meeting in Baku, blew the whistle on the West at that negotiation. Very strong statement from the Indian emissary. She really did a good job. So, the book comes from these two things. One is we really desperately need a vital Cuba solidarity movement, but at the same time, this is a demonstration of how the United States deals with any defiance.
Yeah. Well, kind of along those lines. So in the book, you talk about Operation Mongoose, which was a multi-pronged terrorist plan that the United States imposed following the failed Bay of Pigs, right? So it's not just economic strangulation, but also really violent attacks on the Cuban infrastructure. And so you make it clear more than once the difference between the Republicans and the Democratic presidents, the parties, in that materially to the lives of Cubans, they're interchangeable, right? And so this is something that I think we all struggle with is that perhaps with the Republicans, right, the thin patina of moral concern is just completely removed, right? They just don't care, particularly with a guy like Trump, right? And so I think it's on everyone's mind, like, what is your assessment of the current situation with Trump about to take a second term, and with Marco Rubio, of all people, likely to get appointed as the Secretary of State?
I mean, this is a very complicated situation, and it really depends about, with how the Ukraine situation plays out. It is actually telling that the Biden administration is trying to trap Trump into not being able to settle the situation in Ukraine by permitting Ukraine to fire US missiles into Russian territory. The Biden administration is almost willing the Russians to to provoke the Russians to retaliate in such a way that it'll become hard for Trump to close that war down. But you see, if Trump is interested in doing what I call the reverse Kissinger strategy, then it's going to be hard for Marco Rubio to act on Venezuela and Cuba. And let me explain this a little bit. Henry Kissinger used to argue that the great threat to the United States is if China and Russia make an alliance and become the dominant power in the largest landmass on the earth. And so, for which reason, Kissinger argued that the United States should befriend China. He wrote a giant book called China where he makes this case. If the United States and China find common, ground, then they can sort of suffocate Russia. And this, of course, benefits the US. China doesn't gain from it. The United States benefits. That was the Kissinger strategy. In a way, Trump has the reverse Kissinger strategy. The United States befriends Russia to squeeze China. And in fact, all indications suggest that in term two, Trump is going to go into the reverse Kissinger. He's already said he's going to try to bring peace in Ukraine. There is a section of Steve Bannon's right wing that believes Russia is the correct ally because they're Christians against the heathens and so on. There's a lot of this underneath the kind of madness of this position. And at the same time, Trump is saying we're going to put more tariffs on China and so on. This is the reverse Kissinger strategy. The problem is, if Trump accelerates the reverse Kissinger strategy, over the course of the past few years, Russia has got very close to Cuba and to Venezuela, extremely close. I mean, they are considered to be close allies and so on. So if the reverse Kissinger is going to go into effect in Eurasia, it's going to be difficult for Mr. Trump to allow Marco Rubio to push a regime change strategy against Cuba and Venezuela. I don't think they've thought this through yet, that you can't do the reverse Kissinger and overthrow the governments in Venezuela and Cuba unless we are miscalculating Russia. And Russia says, well, if we're going to have peace with the US, then we wash our hands off Cuba and Venezuela. I don't think that's going to happen. I also think that the Trump government is overestimating its ability to break the strategic alliance between Russia and China. But this is a long way of saying, I think Mr. Trump has placed Marco Rubio in a position basically to control Rubio's all and every move. Secretaries of state don't actually drive policy. They just fly around the world and do the bidding of the president. I mean, Blinken, for instance, didn't direct policy. He did whatever Biden told him. Hillary Clinton, in recent years, was one of the few people who seemed to have an independent position, and that might have been the deal she struck with Barack Obama. But even Hillary Clinton, I mean, the difference between her and Obama was zero on most issues. So I really think in this period, if Trump is serious about the reverse Kissinger, he's going to tie himself in knots when it comes to the Caribbean.
Yeah, the joke is, what is it, that the Democrats uh, want war with Russia, and the Republican Party just wants war with the Chinese. And it's basically what we're seeing. And it was, I think, remarkable that I think it was the Russian vice president went to Venezuela after the Brazilians had vetoed their entrance into BRICS, which is a big thing. Usually they send like the Ministry of the Exterior or the Foreign Affairs or something like that. But the fact that they sent the vice president, I think, was telling of their relationship, right? That it's not just one of it's not just on its relationship that it's an aesthetic one or something like that.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, just to say about that, I mean, uh, again, it's what I just presented, this reverse Kissinger. Um, I think if you look at the statements, you can't add them up, from the new administration. They don't add up. But that doesn't mean that 1 + 1 is not going to be 6. They can do lots of things. And I think it behooves the Cuban Revolution to prepare for very, very difficult times, which is why solidarity is even more important. Because, you can never tell with the United States government. It is truly, as Richard Nixon says, a madman. Chomsky calls the US government a gangster or the mafia. Take your poison. It doesn't matter. Madman, gangster, mafia. It's all pretty scary to me. So you got to always prepare because, they can come up with some pretty strange, things. Give you an example. I just did a story on Yemen. The head of Central Command, U.S. Central Command, and Joe Biden have both said that U.S. bombing of Yemen is not working, but they said we're going to do it anyway. Biden was asked this directly. Is the US bombing of Yemen stopping the Yemenis from trying to defend the Palestinians? Biden's answer, no. Are you going to continue bombing Yemen? Yes. This is not just Biden, it's also his chief military person for the area. So, you take your pick, madman, gangster, mafia, doesn't matter to me. It all amounts to the same thing. It's totally irrational. It's
Mhm.
completely irrational. His major military man in the region says that the solution to what's happening in the Red Sea, and this is a direct quote, will not come at the end of a weapon. It will not come at the end of a weapon, meaning it's political. And yet they're going to keep bombing. So, regardless of all the kind of political niceties I've laid out here, the contradictions, you can never know what they're going to do. And that's terrifying.
Yeah, it's the same. I mean, it's the Vietnamese strategy, right? You just keep bombing and bombing. Um, it doesn't necessarily mean, yeah, success. Well, I'm glad you bring up Russia because I think Russia is a good way to understand the complexities of all this. And then I think a lot of people on the left struggle with, Russia's, like you say, strategic alliance with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Syria, you know. And so, as we as we move into Thanksgiving week, at least in the United States, uh, I do like to think about what I call exploring the liberal mind, right? Which is, I should have a better name for it. But basically, I do want to understand what keeps people on the cusp, like what prevents them from understanding global politics in a way that's based in logic, not based on, kind of textbook ideology. And so, you can have people. In my mind, Cuba is not unlike Venezuela in that people generally are unaware of the political discourse within the population, within the party, right? And maybe they mistrust corporate media, but they still kind of retain this kind of vague gray feeling inside of them about Cuba.
Oh,
And so I was wondering, like, how do you respond to people? You do this a bit in the book, but how do you respond to people in the United States who let kind of the hegemony get in the way, right? That I like to say that they can't get the man out of their heads, right? So what do U.S. middle class people need to understand about Cuba so that they can start to get the man out of their heads?
well, I'm sorry. Every week from Tricontinental, we put out a newsletter. Goes to a lot of people. I'm often surprised when I go to places and people say, "Oh, I read your newsletter." Anyway, this week the newsletter is going to be about the ICC warrants and so on, the International Criminal Court warrant on Mr. Netanyahu. But it's also on Freedom House, which was set up in 1941 in Washington, D.C. Funded by the US State Department, pretends to be independent, and has a sort of freedom index. If you look at the most recent freedom index, Cuba is unfree, Venezuela is not free, et cetera, et cetera. China not free, but Israel is free. Israel gets a score of 74 out of 100, which is pretty good. It's free. Now, of course, the authors of this report, who are so-called independent analysts in Washington, D.C., think tank people and whatnot. I don't know who they are. They don't get listed in the methodology. Anyway, of course, they recognize that, there's bad things happening to the Palestinians and so on. But somehow a country that is occupying several million people, that conducts an apartheid system inside its borders against a designated minority, and then is now in the middle of a genocidal war, is named free. And this is an index that is widely used by the media in the West, as if it's a correct index. Israel is free, Cuba is not free. Uh, Take your pick again. What does it mean to say Cuba is not free? I mean, there was an enormous electoral process which I participated in and accompanied to build a new family law. Now, Cuba has been through a lot of debate and discussion, horrendous policies against homosexuals during part of the period of the revolution in the 1960s, and sort of terrible, typical macho attitude towards, sexual minorities and so on. But the revolution has grown a lot, a lot of arguments, a lot of debates. And, this family law that was passed went through discussion and dispute from the smallest community all the way up to the National Assembly, and then eventually was put to a vote and won after a lot of debate and deliberation. Now, that's pretty interesting and extraordinary. Is that not a democratic process? What is democracy? You can't tell me that the elections in Western countries where there's an abstention rate of 40% is a democracy. That this sounds ridiculous. So this idea, this sort of fantasy of how these terms or these concepts should be understood, and then these indices that are produced that seduce us, into believing that, well, all said and done, all said and done, Sweden is a free country. Germany is a free country. Germany is a free country where I can't wear a keffiyeh, or you can't put out a Palestinian flag. It's that free. You can't have a conference that discusses Palestine. It's that free. Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece, banned from Germany because he was to speak on Palestine at a conference. And by the way, they banned Yanis not only from entering Germany, but from doing webinars into Germany from Greece. But it's a free country. It's still designated as a free country in the Freedom House, and this makes me laugh. This whole level of hypocrisy makes me laugh. And it looks ridiculous. It's ridiculous to say that Israel is free, but let's say China is not. In what way? Also, freedom is entirely debated around question of elections. What about the freedom to not have to live in a box on the street, or the freedom not to starve and so on? What about those freedoms? Why aren't those freedoms on the docket? When you do these calculations, uh, you know, China abolished absolute poverty. That sounds pretty democratic to me, but it's again designated not free. So yeah, you said get the man out of the head, also out of the indices that you read and so on. It's all over the place.
Well, I mean, just one of the things, like for instance, you point out in the book, um, one of the reasons why Cuba's been able to, I guess, punch above their weight in terms of their response to these hurricanes, natural disasters, is because of their decentralization. Decentralization of the energy system, so that if you knock out one place, the entire island doesn't lose power. Decentralization of response, that you have local teams, community teams to be able to respond to these things, and so that in and of itself has countered this narrative about Cuba being this rigidly top-down, place, this island full of just automatons that follow orders, or else they get thrown into jail, right? Just the structure. Yeah.
I mean, there was a protest in July, a couple of years ago. Hot protest, hot summer. People were upset. Lots of things were not going right. Um, People had a right to protest, frankly. The blockade is tough. Yeah. It's one of those things about the blockade. If the United States government thinks the blockade isn't working, in other words, that the problems in Cuba are because of the government, then why do the blockade? Uh, just get rid of the blockade. Show that the government is incompetent. If the blockade is not what's causing the problems, get rid of it. But they maintain it because they know it's a blockade that's squeezing people. So people were upset, they protest. Okay. There was a big UN cry about on the internet, J11 and so on. Turns out a lot of those accounts were from Miami that was spreading, J11, freedom for Cuba, whatever. Okay. The president of Cuba, by the way, the first time a president of Cuba wears blue jeans. It's an interesting development. My old friend Fidel Castro would never have really liked to have been seen in blue jeans. If he was a man of military fatigues and suits, and then later in his life tracksuits, but really not blue jeans. So the president of Cuba gets into his car in his blue jeans and drives to the epicenter of this uprising, these protests, and he walks the streets and talks to people. It's quite an extraordinary thing. You can watch the videos on YouTube. There he is walking the streets, talking to people, settles things down. People were angry. They should be angry. The blockade has cut off supplies for a lot of things. Things are hard. There's no bread in some places, electricity, and so on. But he went and walked the streets and said, "Look, it's not us, okay? It's not the revolution. You can't do a blockade and then like you can't just break through the blockade easily." I mean, he went and just explained the situation to people. This is extraordinary. In any other country in the West, they would be met with gunfire. They send in the police and so on. You don't see this. And this is extraordinary. This is the history of that process. It is extraordinary. I remember seeing this in other countries as well. This was the case in Burkina Faso. In the early years, people were upset. Sankara used to walk the streets, talk to people. He wasn't afraid of his own public. He didn't fear that they'll spit on him or yell things at him. He was happy walking amidst them. And I think that's something. That's something. But that wasn't reported. What was reported was there was protests. Of course, there's protests. Nothing wrong with protests. Protests are good. They show that people have, the right to, they feel like they can say things. Now, people also turn around and say, but there are political prisoners. Of course, there are every society has political prisoners. That's the nature of having a state. We're trying to get to a point of human history where we don't have a state. But until then, you're going to have a state. You're going to have political prisoners. That goes without saying.
Well, one of the things, back to the protest. One of the things a liberal might think, or even a leftist might think about is, and I think it's a legitimate political question that, are the Cubans and are the Venezuelans for that matter, are they materially better off now, even under the blockades, than they would otherwise be as, clients of the United States government? And so you answer this a little bit in the book, but what do you broadly say to that?
Well, it's interesting. I've thought a lot about this. And the first thing you'd have to say, Luisa, is that what we're talking about is a surrender, rather than going back to 1959 and starting again. Yeah, we're saying now the Cubans surrender. They say, okay, we're going to surrender to the blockade, and we're going to say the government is going to go. Here's Gorbachev. We're going to have elections, and so on. Yeah. The issue is that if you look at comparable places and compare their trajectories, you're going to get pretty startling results. So in the book, we compare Haiti to Cuba, because in Cuba, there was a revolution, a socialist revolution eventually in 1959. In Haiti, there was a counter revolution in 1957, led by Papa Doc Duvalier, Jean-Claude Duvalier. Now, the thing is that Mr. Duvalier was fully backed by the United States. I mean, his gangs were going around killing political opponents. He jailed everybody. It was a violent regime, lasted till the 1980s. Um, During the time of Papa Doc and then Baby Doc Duvalier, the Cubans were building a healthcare system, education system, transforming the nature of the distribution and production of goods and so on. In Haiti, the Duvaliers basically ate the fat of the land and rack rented the population. When you look at the situation, health indices in the 1980s, there is no comparison. You would shudder to want to be born in Haiti around then, shudder because the situation was so bad. Whereas in Cuba, despite the blockade, the situation was much better than it had been in Haiti, which was backed by the US government. Now, imagine today where the Haitian government is basically non-functional. The United States asked the Kenyan government to send policemen to police the streets. There was hitmen from Miami and from the Colombian mercenaries that went and took out the Haitian president, and nobody cares to finish the investigation. I mean, that's a good comparison. You can't compare Haiti to, let's say, Hawaii, because Hawaii was colonized the same time as Cuba, right? Cuba was taken by the US in 1898, so was Hawaii. But Hawaii was basically stripped of its sovereignty and made into a tourist paradise, where the Hawaiian people were treated as second-class citizens. Another good comparison, yeah. In Cuba, it is not a tourist paradise. The Cuban people still have exercise sovereignty. The thing is, you travel to Hawaii, it looks beautiful, yeah. You drive through Honolulu, whatever, go to the beaches, everything looks spectacular. But that's for you as a tourist. How is it for the native Hawaiians? How has it been? The destruction of their sovereignty. How has it been for them? If you go to Cuba, it's difficult for the tourist. Matters are not so easy. Things don't always work. The better hotels have problems. There may not be good running water. There's a lot of food not on the menu, and so on. But the Cuban people haven't been stripped of their sovereignty. They still have dignity. So, I mean, it's difficult to have a one-on-one comparison, either with, say, Haiti or Hawaii. But certainly, these are good comparisons. You're not comparing Havana, to, I don't know, to Paris. Yeah. Paris was the center of an empire. Havana was the outreach. These are all false comparisons. Better comparison is Cuba with Hawaii. And from the standpoint of the native, whether they maintain or keep their sovereignty, or good comparison is with Haiti, where you compare the counter-revolution of 1957 of the Duvaliers with the Cuban Revolution, and then think about outcomes.
I remember having an exchange with somebody in Venezuela about how he didn't uh, he didn't understand how his father would always point out people wearing new clothes. And so it took his own political development to understand like that was a new thing. That was because of the Venezuelan Revolution and because the Bolivarian Revolution. And so that was even under the blockade, at least there's access to those kinds of things because prior to Chavez, poor people had just a couple pairs of clothes. Your nice clothes were your work clothes. And those were the ones given to you from work to be able to go to the factory or wherever. And so it was just extraordinary for his father to be able to see people wearing new clothes, even if they were, polyester from China, whatever. And so those are the things that people don't understand about, Cuba pre-revolution or Venezuela pre-revolution, how terrible things were. Um, so pivoting more to like Fidel as a person. Um, so you write in the book, after the Castro made a speech after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. And so he said, how can they come, the United States, how can they come speak about free enterprise to a country where there was unemployment, illiteracy, and where one had to beg to get into a hospital? The people knew that free enterprise was social clubs and bathing in mud for the children. And so this is, I guess, more of a philosophical question about the nature of, I don't know, one's political consciousness. But, Fidel and Che, they did know about the social clubs and they weren't dirty as children, right? They come from privilege. And so the material advantages that they railed against in an unequal society are the same ones that they were afforded in their own early lives. And so, with Che, it's a little bit easier to explain. He did write, the motorcycle diaries very famously. But what is it about them, right, and their political development? Why was it so effective that these people of privilege were ready to arm themselves for the sake of class solidarity?
But this is not uncommon. This has been there right from the start of revolutionary movements in the 19th century. They've always attracted people who were horrified by the hypocrisies of the world. So many of the early anarchists in the 19th century came from positions of relative privilege where, they had been able to see, and this idea is important, relative privilege. They didn't come from the kings and the royal families. They came from middle class stock who were upset by indignity. I mean, Fidel says it in his amazing autobiography, which was basically dictated to Ignacio Ramonet. It's an incredible book where Fidel talks about his childhood, and he grew up in a rural, isolated part of Cuba. Um, his parents had their ancestry from Spain, but he went to school, the local school. He hung out with children who were children of farm workers. He was just upset by indignity. I mean, that's the kind of person he was. He goes to law school, not to uphold the law, but to use the law to make a better world. That's what he goes there to do. And in fact, I highly recommend to people, if they've never read his tremendous speech, History Will Absolve Me, from 1953, I really recommend it. It's an extraordinary speech because you get a sense of his sort of biblical, prophecy, where he's angry, and yet he says, "This is what, if we come to power, this is what we're going to do," and he lays it out. We're going to do this. We're going to, and then when they come to power 6 years later, he follows almost exactly what he lays out in History Will Absolve Me. He believed that the world could be a better place. I've spent time with him, and he has that indignation, right up till his last days. He was a man who was moved by things. He was not cynical, and I think that's very important. Is that it doesn't matter where you come from, if you understand indignity in the world, hypocrisy, and so on, and you believe, if you're sincere about your beliefs, you'll want to change things. He was an extremely sincere person. There was no cynicism in him, no artifice. He believed, you know, he believed that the planet was worth saving. He believed in humanity. I admire people who have that sort of unshakable belief. They don't get disappointed. They don't lose hope. I mean, the Soviet Union collapses, and he gives some of his most powerful speeches, which are about belief in the capacity of humans. Imagine that. Cuba in a special period, things in really hard position, and he comes out there fighting and says, "Battle of ideas. Get down to the root of it." I mean, I'm impressed. Even telling you all this makes my heart warm because I think of the old man, and I think that, well, this is his death day today. What an amazing human being. He believed in us, in our capacities, however wretched and useless we are. He believed in us. And that's meaningful to me.
But I guess I think so much about why, because he wasn't like, you know, Evo Morales, right? He grew up very poor, right? Same thing with Chavez. He grew up with educated poor people, but poor nevertheless. And so he never, I guess, struggled with the experience of that indignity in the way that so many other leftists have, right? To go through that, to understand those experiences, what that feeling is like. Um, as far as I could tell, they didn't have that. So I'm always impressed, I guess, by them. What made their what fueled, I guess, you could call it class suicide, right? What made it so effective? And I'm still, I guess, trying to figure it out. Maybe they were just special. Maybe they were just that was their personalities, that it was enough to just see it for them to really commit themselves to it.
Also, they grew up in a place where they had proximity to poverty. And I think that's important. People now in very affluent parts of the world, poverty is distanced. You don't know the homeless person on the street. As a kid, you don't play with homeless children. I mean, he played with the landless agricultural laborers' children. He had proximity to that class. And so it's not just about his background, it's about his experiences, and then his commitments that come out of those experiences. Yeah, I mean, Xi Jinping, for instance, comes from the current president of China, comes from a family where his father was participated in the revolution. But during the Cultural Revolution, he was sent into the countryside. He had a lot of experiences, regardless of where he came from. And then, when he became party secretary, he, spent every day traveling to a different village to learn about the poverty that people lived in, and committed himself that if he ever rises up, the main task he's going to fulfill is to eradicate absolute poverty. Well, that came from his experiences, where he went and traveled and met people and made an effort to do this, because he also had lived in the countryside, in his early 20s, and had those experiences. Those experiences produced his commitment. So I wouldn't put it past the power of experience, which is different from, let's say, the place of origin. Your identity or your place of origin can be something, but your experiences can be another, and I think those experiences are precious and need to be understood. What does it mean for a person of, let's say, a affluent family to grow up amongst poor people, or what does it mean for somebody of some means, nonetheless, to say, I'm interested in studying the nature of enduring poverty in our society, and then that creates its own commitment. So I think these are, of course, biographical things, right? Every individual has a biography, but I'm just, in a way, Luisa, standing up for the power of experience, not just of the experience of your origin, but the experience of your life, which can transform you, and make you understand a journey, that you're capable of.
I want to read. Are you familiar with John Jeter? He's a journalist. Okay. Well, he wrote once, he was exchanging with a friend of his in Georgia. He's Black. And so at what point, part of this conversation, they were talking about Fidel Castro and says, going back to the Brazilian quilombos and the abolitionists, there have always been whites who have articulated a kind of class solidarity with Blacks. Here in the US, we've got John Brown and people like Marlon Brando back in the day. Black South Africans had John Slovo, and Caribbean Blacks had Simon Bolivar. But to my knowledge, the African diaspora has never, ever, since the first white man stepped on the continent 500 years ago, seen a white man quite like Fidel Castro. And so his experience um, also transcend that of just poor Cubans, right? And you could see this, and you write extensively about this in the book about Cuba's solidarity with with movements in continental Africa.
Yeah, look at the Cuban Revolution's commitment to African national liberation movements. It's beyond understanding. I've interviewed a number of people who fought in Angola, discussed things with them, and so on. These were young people, um, told, we're going to go there because we have to stand up against this hideous racism, on the continent, apartheid system, and so on. They went and they defeated the South African government at the Battle of Cuito Conivale in 1987, which was really the impetus for the downfall of the apartheid regime. Mandela, his first port of call was Havana, and he came and thanked the Cubans for coming into Angola and starting a front, an open war against the South African regime. The Namibian president has many times said, he died, the previous president, many times said that, the extraordinary thing about the Cubans is that they came and helped us and didn't want anything. They didn't come and take minerals or anything like that. Look, Cuba has its own problems with race. Race has a deep set of roots in societies of slavery, deep roots. In Cuba, there's a commission that has been dealing with issues of racism now for decades. They write reports, they hold all island meetings. The leadership is very much seized on the issue. Takes a long time. Let's not fool around. It's you're not going to say, oh, today let's just snap our fingers and racism ends. It's a big journey, but they're in it. They're in the fight to change things. That's good enough for me. I don't look at a country for perfection. Somebody can point to some article where somebody says, look, I had an experience of racism. Well, of course. For God's sake, let's go and try out our luck in Dominican Republic. What's it like to be a Haitian there? These are the deep roots of slavery. It's going to take a long time, but at least they're on the journey. They're committed to eradicating racism. I applaud them for that. But it's tough work. This is not child's play. Child's play is fun. This is hard work.
So I was wondering, I think there's a lot of there's lack of knowledge in terms of how el Partido Comunista de Cuba, like how they exist, what the structure is like, right? The Cuban Communist Party. And my understanding, which could be wrong, is that it's not unlike the Communist Party of China in that, they get together and when they make a plan, they make a plan, right? They stick to it. So every 5 years or so, they'll make a plan and stick to it. And so one example was, for instance, when they decided to just get rid of the gray market, right, and let people have, legalize the small businesses. That way, you didn't have to, sneak into people's houses and pay for dinner and stuff like that. So, can you talk a little bit about how the I sound like Amy Goodman? Talk about how the Communist Party of Cuba, how it functions and how decisions are made, because, well, there's a lot of disinformation about there too.
Yeah, I mean, it's firstly, there are many institutions on the Cuban island. The Communist Party of Cuba is one institution. There's an assembly, which is an elected body. Everybody in the body is not necessarily a party member. There's also the committees to defend the revolution. There are local committees, councils of different kinds, and there's an entire array of organized bodies on the island. There's governmental ministries. There's also sectoral groups, sports groups. There's that huge number of things. I mean, when an island like that has to make a serious decision, it is completely mobilized to hold conversations. Now, at the time of a party congress, like in all other countries where there's a communist party type situation, it mobilizes millions of people into the debate and discussion. It's interesting. I mean, these are old-fashioned political parties. In other words, the centralized body will produce a draft text, based on a whole. So first there'll be local congresses, and then a draft text is produced from the centralized body. That gets sent back to the localities to debate, produce amendments, and so on. And that goes back up to the center. I mean, these are enormous consultative processes. In fact, they call a lot of them consultative processes. It's not a top-down affair. Because if it were top-down, it would make an enormous number of mistakes in policy because it wouldn't be able to calibrate the popular mood. It wouldn't be able to calibrate ideas that are coming from below. You've got to have space to bring the ideas up. There's always a challenge between too much centralization and too much democracy. This is a balance that you have to strike. And, you can look at the last 60 odd years and you can show points where it was too much centralization. At other points, there was perhaps too much democracy. Things didn't get done. There was no decision made, and so on. You can, on balance, you can go back and reflect. But these are interesting processes of how to build mass democracy, not electoral democracy, but mass democracy. An electoral democracy is where I go to a ballot box and I choose a representative to represent me, and then I go back to my life for 5 years. I don't have to really be engaged. I could if I want to. I could join a civil society group, an NGO, a lobby. I could put money and become a lobby and lobby a person. But the bulk of people take a back seat and let their representatives deal with things. That's a representative electoral democracy. That's a certain model. This is mass democracy, constant mobilizations of people into discussions and debates. I've, visited these, seen how they work. The sectoral ones interest me the most. The ones like about doctors, where there's those conversations, they interest me a lot. Sports people, because they debate, they believe sports in Cuba is not the reason they don't allow anything that's not amateur is they believe sports is a universal a universal project. Everybody should do sports because it's related to the health ministry. It's not about making money. It's not about commodification. Sports is about health. So The sports people all have deliberations and discussions. What is the latest science in sports and so on? That's a kind of mass democracy, very different from, representative democracy.
Um, I think it's good to we take some try to figure out some questions from the chat. So, David asks, the broad U.S. solidarity movement is rightfully focused on Palestine solidarity amidst the genocide. Why do you think it's strategic and important for the movement to build Cuba solidarity at this point in time?
Firstly, I think these are all basically linked issues. The issue is about sovereignty. Should these peoples, Palestinians, Cubans, Venezuelans, etc., be allowed to have sovereignty, or should they buckle under the knee of somebody? Um, I mean, in one sense, I would hope that because the Palestine solidarity movement in many parts of the world is growing quite strong and having a mass character, I hope they will be able to absorb other movements, when time comes, characterize themselves as a people solidarity movement, entertain the possibility of the defense of the Cuban Revolution. I very much hope that would happen.
And this is a similar question. One that I had and phrased in a different way in the chat is basically, did you, and I was curious to know, is there anything that you and Chomsky disagree about with respect to Cuba in the same vein of robust debate?
I mean, the thing is that, I've known him for 35 years. He's a very dear friend of mine, and we stay clear of things we don't agree on. For instance, I've never talked to him about the Soviet Union or Lenin in all the years. We just never talked. I've written books about it. He has made comments. He's disparaged Lenin. I edited the selected Lenin. But what's the point of having there's no room for a debate there, because we have very fixed and firm positions. It's not going to be valuable. There are other things, in actually very interesting. He insisted on telling me these stories about political prisoners in Cuba and how when he went to Cuba, he raised the issue and so on. I have a slightly more idiosyncratic view on political prisoners. He is a formalist on this issue. All political prisoners are bad. It's like he's a formalist on free speech. I'm not a formalist on free speech. I think speech is part of the class struggle. Classes impose silence. The dominant classes impose silences on us. We fight against that. But when the people triumph, we're going to silence some things as well. You know, um, some attitudes must be attacked directly. For instance, I'm not open to racist speech at all. Sexist. There's no room for that. But he is a formalist, so of course we disagree on those kind of things. You know, I don't have a my head doesn't explode. When people talk about political prisoners, I'm willing to have that conversation. I've been to prison several times for political activities, protests and so on, but also, once for a period of time, basically, it was a political disagreement. It's the class struggle. We fight against it. We fight for the release of people. But I'm not horrified when there are political prisoners in the country. It's part of the class struggle.
Yeah, Dan Kovalik, you're familiar with, said that, in terms of like crimes against humanity, you're going to find that in every single country, right? And then really the question is whether those people, whether or not it's a matter of state law, right? That's the question. And then that question becomes more complex when you ask questions like, well, freedom from hunger, freedom from homelessness, and stuff like that. I think these things can be not complicated in a bad way, but complicated in that it helps our development, right? As socialists. Okay, well, that's right at the hour. I think that's a good place to stop. You clearly got to get on a plane. So thank you, Vijay. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Well, firstly, I want to again say thanks a lot for this, Luisa. I think it's great for me to be able to talk about this book. The book was done, preciously, in the last weeks before Noam had a stroke, and it was extremely painful, uh, and it continues to be painful. That um, that we can't discuss, or he can't come out here and talk about this book, which we really had fun making. And during the making of the book, we had so many conversations about language and about you know the fact that I was playing around with writing about sports, and there was so many interesting conversations. And I really wish um, he could have been here. He would have loved discussing these things. And I would have loved it if you had asked him, why didn't you guys talk about Lenin? And I would like to have heard his reaction. You heard my reaction, but I wonder what he would have said. Um, I adore him. He's a terrific person, and it's one of my great honors in life to have been able to do two books with him. So thanks for that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.